So Justin, what does being a great session player mean to you?
It's being a good kind of supporting role, playing a good supporting role to the leading man or actor, or however you want to look at it. Being of support to the vocal, the song. Being a good co-star to the song or the artist or both. Stick out in a good way, but not try and steal the spotlight, from the song or the artist.
That's a really great metaphor and like imagery to think about it. And with the feeling of how we want records to feel alive,
right.
You can think about like being on stage and then remembering kind of where you are in comparison to the spotlight and finding your moments to step out.
For a session player, that's a big part of it, is sort of discerning when those moments are there for you or whether they should be for one of your other players on the floor or the vocal. Discerning that is a big part of it.
Absolutely. At what point in your early life did you start to listen to music that way? Was there ever a point where you remember sort of starting to think about music as less of a fan and more as a musician or a player?
Absolutely. As a teenager, I got a guitar magazine that had an interview with Brent Mason, who's a session player, and it sort of opened my eyes to what it meant to be a session player. And so I started scouring through liner notes with the idea that, there's these people that make the records. And so that got me thinking about what it means to do that job, as opposed to just playing guitar on stage for fans or whatever, which is, kind of, I would guess the majority of people who get into music, like that's their idea of what being a musician is. But about the time I was taking guitar seriously was the same time I discovered what a studio musician was. And I got tunnel vision pretty quickly about headed towards that. That seemed really interesting to me. Not even knowing it now, I can look back and realize that I was way more hot on the idea of creating than I was on performing. Yeah, that Brent Mason article did that for me. I was probably, I want to say 16, 17 years old.
Yeah, that's incredible. And a really great lesson in being self-aware and understanding kind of where your passion lies.
Right.
And also the education to be able to learn what are the opportunities, what are the potential occupations or roles that you could have if you really love playing an instrument. How can you get paid to do that? And then learning what that path is and then thinking about yourself, well, what excites me more? And then it seems like you discovered that pretty early on. It was pretty fortunate, thing.
Super fortunate. And growing up in Northern California, as a teenager, sorting that stuff out, realizing, okay, well, even at that point, it was already pretty clear that Nashville was the place for live recording.
Why was that?
As opposed to LA, they were still doing, you were starting to see that, like, the bands of the 90s were starting to go away. It was starting to become more in the box music coming out of LA. And so Nashville was kind of the last place where live musicians sit in a room and record together. And so that made it really attractive for me. Even though I played some country as a kid, but I played probably more rock and roll than country, and grunge and all that stuff that I grew up on. But I had tunnel vision about guitar at the time, but I realized along the way, really it was just about being in the studio. I sort of stumbled on, I'd always been a multi-instrumentalist, but I stumbled onto pedal steel. And then that seemed like, there's a opportunity here. It's something that came quickly to me, and I'm going to jump on this because that'll get me in the studio faster, maybe. I do remember having that thought, which is a little bit opportunistic maybe, but I just knew that I wanted to be in the studio more than I wanted to be touring, and that felt like a chance because there wasn't a whole lot of steel players because it's really hard to play, and there's not a lot of teaching material, so you just don't see a lot of people playing it.
Well, I think it's a really great insight in being able to find the space
Right.
in an industry that's really saturated.
Yes.
So like, where is that sort of way that you can get your, first step in the door and get your first opportunities? And that's a great example of how, like, in some ways it could just be on a specific type of instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Just looking at the environment that you're in and recognizing where do people need help.
Yes.
And I found that in my career as a producer and engineer, when I moved to town, it was kind of like in a similar thing, but aside from the instruments, it was trying to figure out what role I could play to be valuable to a studio or to a producer, because they kind of had their people already. And so where I found my first in was more in programming in country music, because it was at a time where it was transitioning into that. There weren't as many people doing it. And somebody found out that I was a DJ and that I built tracks. And so my first opportunities were track stuff.
Right.
And then that opened a door into, hey, can you cut this vocal? Can you edit this thing? Can you mix this thing? And then you start getting pulled in these different directions. So you found that, and then people saw, well, yeah, you're also a great guitar player and electric guitar player, utility player. And so you can pull out all those other tools once you find your space, to get in. So I'm sure that's different for everyone. It may not be that everybody needs to go buy a pedal steel in order to find their step in, but it's an incredible example of a process or philosophy, I guess, to be able to figure out where your first step could be.
For sure. And that's probably the most challenging part about it, is that we all do have to find our own spot. I was really fortunate to get some of that really good advice from a studio player named Russ Paul early on. He really encouraged me not to copy anybody, to find your own identity. It feels risky to do something new, but really it's way less risky than copying somebody else who's already good,
Right.
because that person already exists. I've heard it said, like Neil Young said, copying somebody musically is like following somebody in a parking lot looking for a space. They're always going to get in there before you, because that's their authentic path and you're just copying it.
Were there any specific things for you that you kind of remember coming across or discovering in figuring out what your different thing would be?
For sure. Like, so growing up a guitar player, inspired by, adventurous guitar players, anybody from, Jimmy Page or Tom Morello or The Edge, or once I had a childhood of learning that stuff. And then in college, I was in like an Americana band, and we thought pedal steel would be a cool addition to the band. Well, then I was able to sort of I was already playing a lot of slide guitar. I'd grown up listening to the Allman Brothers as well. And so taking all of that more aggressive or assertive approach to playing and putting that on a pedal steel was automatically new. Like, nobody had done much of that, And so just taking what I had and applying it to the steel was a pretty natural process in finding my own voice, and pretty effortless, in that way. And I was really fortunate that it also happened to be at a time when Nashville wanted the steel to be a little bit different.
As you were discovering that, was there anyone that shared insight on you to help you understand, well, there's not as many pedal steel players, the music is getting a little bit more aggressive, or was this something that you learned through observation?
I just learned it through observation, really. I mean, I have all my friends are musicians too, and so they were pretty encouraging. My guitar playing buddies were pretty encouraging of that new direction, because there wasn't many younger steel players, period, let alone people trying new stuff. So, yeah, a lot of it was my own observation. A lot of it was just encouragement from peers that were trying to do, similar work.
Yeah, so I think the strong takeaway from that is just to be aware of the environment that you're in and get out in that environment.
For sure.
Getting around the community, playing with as many people as you can, and starting to discover what could be kind of missing in here, and what would be like the next kind of thing. Start experimenting, and then be aware of the feedback that you're getting to know if you're kind of headed in the right direction, or if people are looking or saying, hey, what are you doing? That's pretty cool, and standing out. So as you were doing that and starting to, find those guitar player buddies and start to, get some gigs, where did some of your first studio opportunities come from?
I can almost track it back to one gig almost. Like, so I had this idea of playing steel in a different way, kind of utilizing some of my influences like, Derek Trucks or Jeff Beck or those kinds of more aggressive kind of approaches. And I remember having a conversation over lunch with Rob McNally about it and telling him I kind of have this idea about treating steel like this, or maybe steel if it was on a Black Keys album, or steel, like I want this to be a direction that I kind of flesh out a little bit. And he at the time thought that was interesting enough that he included it in he was doing some original music of his own at clubs around Nashville.
Right. We talked about that in his interview.
It was immediately a credibility booster. And I didn't know that was how that was going to go. But he's so good and he's so respected around Nashville that people just seeing me making, music with him immediately opened doors. Immediately. I mean, it wasn't like, booked 100% all the time, but it definitely started the trickle of work in the studio, just being on stage with him.
Right. And how did you meet Rob?
I know I used to go see him play he had this side project called Walrus. I would go see him, and I think I met him at those gigs. We sort of ran in similar circles, and so we got to know each other just by being out and about. That's another thing that, if anybody, no matter what it is that you're wanting to do, whether it's tour or be in the studio or whatever, you just got to go out and be amongst the people, whether it's being around other players, because they're the ones that are going to rope you in.
So that's an example that a lot of the players have talked about in finding an opportunity where something's kind of already happening and figuring out how you can be valuable to that, situation. And the way to get into that, environment is by getting out, going around, meeting folks. The challenging thing, I think, for a lot of people is figuring out the balance between building relationships and kind of making friends with people, and then also being able to have some kind of like trajectory with, with opportunities. And so I think patience plays a big, role in that. What was your sort of like timeline like of that trajectory, and how did you stay patient in your process of
I was never patient. I always felt like I was behind. Like I said earlier, it's like I grew up a guitar player. I started playing steel in my early 20s. So that's a pretty late start to an instrument if you're wanting to do something in a professional capacity, relatively speaking. Most people start a lot earlier. It was very difficult to stay patient. I always was trying to push the ball forward pretty assertively, and always looking for opportunities, not to a predatory degree, but just I always really wanted it to happen. For that pursuit, you sacrifice a lot of sleep. You sacrifice a lot of you don't have hobbies, you just go for it. And so when I would have to have regular jobs, I'd be practicing or playing all night, or going out to shows and trying to find players that are inspiring, to try and figure out if you can somehow get on their radar. And this is really difficult because you want to sit there and find some kind of Zen middle ground where you can be content and ambitious at the same time, but it's very difficult to do. I think as a young person, you kind of have to be cool with just going for it, going hard,
Totally. And I think that there can be a lot of Zen in just understanding that you're just going to feel that way.
Yeah.
Just to, sort of once it happens over and over again, and you kind of like, you get overwhelmed, then you get through it, and then you're like, oh, cool, things are getting a little bit better. And then you're like, oh my God, I'm not, getting it there. And then you realize, at least I realized, this is going to be a lifelong experience. So I just have to accept that it's going to happen, and it's okay that it happens because it means that I am moving forward. But now that I'm like aware that we just think that way naturally because of our motivation and because of our intense passion about being able to do what we do, for a living, I've been able to find a little bit more control in managing it,
for sure.
But just understanding that it's not going to go away is probably the more valuable takeaway from that concept in general of staying patient.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of these things run in cycles, 5 to 7 years, you're in a different version of whatever you're working towards. You start to see, I've been here before. Whether that's trying to break into a new area of the music business or your career, or trying to learn a new skill set, you kind of, as a creative person, I think it's pretty normal to be constantly seeking that stuff out, constantly learning, constantly finding new ways to create. And so in that way, you're kind of beginning again over and over again.
Now, at this point in your career, where you're at the level of being the person that someone would want to talk to and get to know, or be a part of whatever they're a part of, what are some ways that would be good or bad for someone to reach out to someone like yourself and try to make that connection?
Being upfront about it. I mean, I know me and a lot of session player buddies that have had people reach out on Instagram, and that's fine, as long as you're just being cool about it. Don't be assuming, and understand that these people are kind of being hit up from all different angles all the time. If you see that they're playing there at some place, go see them and introduce yourself and let them know that you're interested in doing something kind of like what they're doing, or whatever. And at a time that makes sense, maybe we grab lunch or coffee. Or I did that coming up, and it was super, super helpful.
It's also pretty nerve-wracking, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, Dan Dugmore is the reason why I bought a pedal steel. And I had another session player who was super inviting. Jeff King let me come and watch him do sessions when I was like 19 years old, and super helpful to see what this is. And then I later on started asking him, well, what about Dan? What does he use? What does Dugmore use? And he was like, give him a call. He's a buddy. Like, you should call him. And so I cold called him. I just was like, you don't know who I am, and he took about 15 minutes to just sort of talk with me and tell me what he used. And it was super beneficial in two ways. One, it made it feel possible, because here I am talking to a dude who's doing it. And then also it dispelled the idea that there was any secret ingredient, because when he told me the gear, it was like you could have listed it on one hand. It was like, I use a Fender Twin, and I have a delay pedal, and on the Twin I use the bass on 5, the mids on 5, and the treble on 5. And you're like, it's kind of maddening, because you're like, oh shit, it's just because he's awesome, that's why it works.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's a good kind of North Star to create for yourself. It's like, okay, good gear matters, but not as much as being awesome. It's like that guy could play through anything, and he's going to sound like he belongs on a record. Yes, reach out to people for sure. Just be cool. And most people will try to, carve out some space to either email correspond with you, or grab lunch, or whatever. But yeah, I think that stuff is invaluable, to reach out to the people and be brave enough to do that, because that's going to be your best information a lot of times.
And you talked about being direct or being transparent, with stuff. Does that mean having a clear question, or having like a clear intention about it, rather than just saying, hey, I wanted you to know who I am?
Yeah.
So what advice would you give for how to start that conversation?
Yeah. I usually start it from a point of appreciation, like for Dan, like in the situation with Dan, or like with Rob, it's going up to them and genuinely telling them, dude, I'm a fan of what you do. And maybe letting it just be that at first, I think a lot of times when you're in those situations where you're maybe meeting somebody who you look up to, or you're corresponding with somebody who you look up to, it feels like there's this finite amount of their time you have, and you want to just cut to the chase. But you just got to remember that these are just dudes that do a cool job, whether it's an artist or a writer or a session player or whatever. And, seek out the people that you do have honest, genuine reactions to, so that you can be truthful about it. Don't just try and glom onto anybody who's doing it, because people can sniff that out too, and have specific questions in the chamber though, because so like, say for example, when I first started playing steel and I was struggling, I was having a hard time playing it in tune, technical issues, and Paul Franklin was playing with the Time Jumpers at the Station Inn at the time.
Mhm.
And I would go down there early, and because I had gone and seen the Time Jumpers just kind of to hear him play, and I noticed that he was there very early because he tunes everything by ear. So he sits there meticulously tuning his steel, before the show.
Mhm.
And so I took that opportunity to go up to him and just was like, I'm such a big fan. I'm a newer steel player. I kind of having this problem. Does this seem like anything that you would, he would immediately diagnose it and be like, well, yeah, here's your problem. Here's, if you tune it like this, your thirds will be sweeter. If, you use this kind of thumb pick, and he grabs one and gives it to me, he's like, this will make your low notes, cut through a little better, and then, just find your time to bow out too. Like, he was super helpful, but then, I was very grateful and thankful, and then let him do his thing. And, those little things, finding your moments to talk to masters like that with specific questions, like, whatever is appropriate to your instrument, is super helpful. And most of us are, more than happy to divulge that stuff because we're not trying to, hide the answers to the test over here,
Right. Yeah, I think it's just about the approach of making sure that you're asking the right question or asking a question in the right way.
Yeah, because you don't want to just stumble up on them like Chris Farley talking to Paul McCartney with just aimless you know what I mean? Like you want to like for your own benefit have real questions.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not just like, what's it like in the studio? Like that's not going to do anything for you,
And there's also not a clear answer to those types
That's
of
right.
things,
It's
so
different every day. And some days it's amazing, and some days you're just waiting it out,
So I think the other thing that comes up a lot, and what I took away from one of the first things that you were saying, is that you found like one person, and then that person introduced you to another person because you developed that relationship there. And I think the challenging thing for me when I moved to Nashville was finding any mentor, like anyone that I could just, and the problem was I wasn't approaching it in the right way. I was looking for very generalized opportunity instead of being very specific. So as I started to recognize that, I found, you find a person, and then that person now sees your ability, and then they may think, oh, well, this person could be really helpful for them, or they could be really helpful for each other,
Yeah.
And so it seemed like there was that kind of path in your way too. I think what happens a lot, and I know it happened to me, was that you get really discouraged because you move to a town like this, or you're just in whatever town that you're in, and you're trying to figure out a path. You finally have the courage to reach out to, the person that you look up to, and you don't hear back from them. And then you're like, well, maybe I'll try somebody else. And then maybe you do that 2 or 3 times and nobody answers you. It's not because they didn't want to or because they're assholes or something. They're just busy, and maybe you didn't approach it in the right way. You have no idea what the scenario would be. They could have never even seen the message,
Totally.
And then we get bummed out, and then we're like, well, I guess, not going to be able to find a mentor. So I don't know what I'll do. And then some people just kind of give up. Some people take a different, path. But I think the patient persistence of continuing to reach out to other people until you find the right person. Right. And then once you find that right person, they can introduce you to another right person. So that's just another example of the importance of patience in that process.
Yeah, you do have to have patience, and I think mentorship can appear in different ways. So you can have like direct mentorship, like I was talking to Paul Franklin about my challenges with A, B, and C. Talking with Dan Dugmore about the gear he was using because I loved his tone. Those are like direct, how do I be more like you? Or how do I, but then you have like more symbiotic relationships, like, well, you make friends with other up and coming guitar players or drummers or whatever. And they're able to, because they're a little more unbiased in that they're not competing for the same jobs as you. Right. And those guys' feedback was super valuable in a mentoring kind of way.
Because you're in the same place.
Because we're in the same place, and we're not fighting for the same crumbs. We're all able to get hired on the same things. And so, and it was symbiotic in a way that like we could sort of like pull each other into opportunities, throw each other's names in the hat, because we knew we had fresh ideas and we were good. And it was always... It's helpful confidence-wise to have somebody of your peer group in the room with you, there was many times in the beginning that me and the other guys in my sort of peer group would sort of debrief after the session on the way home. You'd be calling each other and be like, dude, am I crazy, or was that really difficult, or was that as cool as I thought it was? Because that felt cool, right? Or I felt like I got stuck. What could I do? What do you do in that? And so there's a lot of debriefing in more of a symbiotic way with peer group folks like that. So you got to seek out both for sure. Like, because just seeking out the people that do what you do, it's only part of the picture.
So as you started to get into your first, opportunities for things, what were some of the challenges that you had early on, like getting in on your first sessions?
I think it's for most of us, but for me specifically, it was learning to interpret what people were saying. Because, so for example, when you're on a session, the writer or the artist or the producer might say, let's make this a little more Tom Petty or Sheryl Crow or whatever, and they don't mean make it exactly like it. They just want a dash of it. And so there's a million different little things like that are said or communicated through a session. So like learning to interpret what they meant, not doing literally what they said. That was a little bit of a skill set that I had to sort of like work on in the beginning.
How do you manage the difference between what your interpretation is of what Tom Petty means and what their interpretation is? How do you start to investigate that?
It's almost always about how that stuff makes them feel, as opposed to a literal, thing. Right. When people talk about making something sound more Sheryl Crow, it's almost always like whimsical, not too scripted. It's this. And so it's hard to articulate it intellectually, but it is almost always a little combination of like the way those records make you feel, along with a couple notable approaches that those guys tended to use. Right. Like say I'm talking about Petty still, but so learning to interpret what people mean, not literally what they say, was a big turning point for me. I just listened to this interview with Paul Franklin and Lloyd Green, and these two giants of pedal steel guitar session world. And, Lloyd Green kind of intuitively understood this way back in the beginning of his career, but it's like, you got to be serving the song and making music for the people that will be consuming this music, which are mostly not musicians. Understanding that right away frees you up in a lot of ways, because you're like, oh, I don't have to make this super complicated. Sometimes it can be super simple, and that's the best thing. When
I was talking with Jerry McPherson on the podcast, he said we have to figure out how to be brilliantly dumb.
Yes, that's exactly right. You're usually at your 10,000 hours mark by the time you're doing this job, and yet you have to go back and figure out how to access that same youthful simplicity that you maybe were touching on when you were 2 or 3 years into learning your instrument.
I think that's a challenging thing for students or for players that have a degree in music, where they were required to be extremely proficient and polished at their instrument and very specific. And those are really great skills to develop. But then, as you said, you have to figure out how to kind of pull back from those, a little bit. Did you start to recognize that through getting on sessions and just sort of seeing what other people were doing, or did you start to understand that through analyzing music and just kind of listening, like, what is this part, and learning it? Yeah. How did you start to learn some of those instincts?
Yeah, well, and that was a thing I had to work through. I went to Belmont for music, and that's the truth. You learn they want you to learn jazz, they want you to learn some classical, it's all very relatively complicated music harmonically. And for me, the simplest answer is it just kept coming back to records that moved me. What did those sound like? What are those parts like? And so listening to those, and then accepting your instrument's role in that context. So listen to a record, listening to what, if you're a guitar player, listening to what the rhythm guy is doing or the rhythm part is doing, listening to what they're not doing, as compared to maybe how you want to play. But learning those parts exactly informs you so much. If you go learn Mike Campbell's parts, you learn what he's doing and what he's not doing to bring value to a song. And to me, the long answer is it's just back to records. Always listen to great records. If you do that, all the information you need is there. But you got to look at it from bird's eye view, as well. How is this functioning in this mix or in this arrangement, without getting too specific about literally what they're doing? So it can be helpful to look at other disciplines. So you look at film actors or you look at screenwriters or whatever. Like for me, as I've navigated my career, it's super helpful to listen to that stuff. People talk about those gigs too, because it gets you more in a process mindset as opposed to, oh, well, what you need to do is do chugging eighth notes in a chorus. It's like, that's not helpful. Like you need to look at how your process should work in terms of, how do I fit in? How do I fit into, or when should I stand out? Like, those kinds of things. How do I sound like I'm in this band with these people?
I love that metaphor that relates to film and screenwriters and actors and stuff, because I think that record production is so much about telling a story. And we're telling the story of the vocalist and the artist, and then the characters within it. And we have to figure out how to create sounds that are going to help, support that.
For sure.
When I was in grade school, we had music theory class. It was like when I was K through 5, which was super cool that I was able to be introduced to that. It was just public school, and they just back then it was still important for everyone to to learn those basics. And one of my best memories of that was when we learned about orchestral instruments and how they use different instruments to create sound effects to tell a story about the piece. And so I thought that was so interesting, and it stuck with me throughout my career, and thinking about tonality and the shape of a sound and how it can have a certain emotional impact.
Yeah.
So thinking about it in context of how other people tell stories, and then you can pull some of those principles into the process.
For sure.
And I love how you talk about the process being the important thing, because I think that there's a lot of information out there, which is really great, and we live in a great time to be able to access that. But there's also a lot of an understanding that's really important to have, that a lot of times things are described based on the specific scenario. And so you can't necessarily say that one thing is going to work all the time, but you can start to understand a process that will help you discover what that thing is that you need to do,
without leaving people high and dry with, you just got to focus on the process. Even though that is true, what I would say, the way to get to where that starts to make sense. So the more albums that you can kind of dissect and transcribe, the more you can start to find little tools for solving these musical puzzles every time you're wanting to create something. So that's kind of the answer, really, is don't aim to sound exactly like anybody per se, but do look at how they cracked the code on any given song. And so the more you can do that, the more tools in the toolbox you'll have to do it for yourself when you're hired to do something. For me, it's like the gig as a session steel player, my job is not to entertain steel players. You know what I mean? And the sooner you can realize that and get yourself off of that trip and more onto, my job is to be a good supporting partner for the leading person on this thing, whether it's an artist or a songwriter or whatever, you're gonna see your relationship to the songs and to your work shift into a new place that's going to get you hired a lot more.
Once you have that instinct for the part or the purpose and how to play that supporting role, then the job is to execute that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that session players are very great at is having incredible tone. And from the outside looking in, a lot of people would refer that to very expensive instruments and really great vintage gear. And while all of that does have an impact, something that I think that I've recognized as an engineer is that the larger impact comes from what comes out of the player's hands.
For sure.
Were there any things that through your career that you found to be helpful to improve your playing style as a guitar player that supported having good tone regardless of what you were playing or playing through?
For better or for worse, in the beginning, I always looked at it like I was the bigger opportunity for improvement, not my gear. I was never the guy who was buying vintage gear from the beginning or seeking. I was always like, I felt like I was the weak link, not the guitar. Really pushed me to sort out how to get myself sounding good without seeking out the gear spiral of just needing bigger, better things all the time. Mm-hmm. I was lucky. I didn't choose that. I just happened to be of that mindset as a young person. I practiced a lot unplugged. And when you listen to an electric guitar not plugged in, it doesn't take very long before you start hearing how to make the tones a little bigger with your hands on a guitar that's not plugged in. And that was another accident that I think helped my slide playing and guitar playing and whatever, to where I started directly connecting the idea that tone is coming from your hands and not your gear.
Were you just playing to other records? Were you doing exercises? What was the thing that helped you really figure that out?
Always records. And I think that's the thing, is like you just have to go and transcribe and learn and learn and learn and learn. And not only on your instrument, but the other instrument. Why does this work? Why does this guitar part work so good? It's like, oh, it's because that drum pattern allows for it. Or, oh, this bass part really sets it up. Or, just listen.
And that awareness of other instruments is super important, and something that I've seen to be a very important asset when you're sitting in there. Now, these days, not everything is done in a tracking room on the floor with the musicians together. But whether you're playing to a track that you're just overdubbing to, or if you're playing with them together, there's still things that stand out with those instruments. As a guitar player, what are some of the things that you listen for in the other instruments that might inform what you end up playing?
So I look for, it's two things really. It's like, what can I join in on? What can I, if the bass player's doing a move, could it be cooler if I jumped on that and played that with him in my own register, or the opposite. How can I set it up so that becomes more featured? Can I do something that plays off of it in a way that lets it be its own thing? So, and sometimes that's you see us do this all the time. It's like, that's a little bit of a process sometimes. Sometimes you jump on it and you're like, sorry, I made it less cool when I played along with it. Mm-hmm. And so I'll do something different. But so, yeah, it's so important to get in the habit of listening. On the topic of that, one of the most valuable pieces of advice in terms of that was, when I went to Belmont, Dan Huff came and did like a speaking masterclass thing. When he went and talked about, he was just beginning to be a producer. He was talking about making records, playing on records, being a guitar player. He really encouraged us to let your ear tell you what the track needs. Don't let your eyes tell you what the track needs. So that's the danger of, say, learning a bunch of scales or a bunch of shapes. Well, it then becomes an eye exercise as opposed to an ear exercise. Mm-hmm. So try to, in any given scenario, whether it's overdubbing at home, which we do a lot of now, or playing to a pre-existing track, let your ears tell you what this needs. And that can be challenging up first, but it's definitely a muscle worth developing. The better part of you is giving you information, as opposed to, I've got this hot lick and I bet I can shoehorn it in here because it's this key that has a bunch of open strings or some shit like that. It's like, you can't let that kind of ego-driven, flashier side of things make all the decisions. You have to let the more mature and disciplined side of yourself that is more your ear, and it's like, oh yeah, there was this gap where like a rhythmic thing could happen here that could really give somebody a new signature piece to hold on to, and then be willing to admit that you're wrong too. Sometimes is like, try shit and then be willing to pivot quickly. Those ideas don't have a sell-by date. Just put them away and use it somewhere else if it doesn't work. If they're not loving it in the control room, that's the law. You can find ways to gently reposition the question or repose the solution if you want to them, but but yeah, being, I feel like this is attributed to Rob McNally, and I don't know if it is or not, but it's like, you have to be able to have unique approaches to things, unique solutions, but you also need to be able to pivot back to vanilla on a dime. So like, yeah, do weird shit, do creative stuff, do what you think would make this song new or fresh or whatever. But if that's not getting any love in the control room, you need to be able to turn on a dime and give them straight down the middle, scoop of chocolate, scoop of vanilla, get on with your life.
And then feel and get on with your life and feel okay with it.
That's right. That is the job.
Yeah.
Because it's not your record, and that can take folks a long time. Some folks never grasp that, and that makes being a session player agonizing. The best example of that is there was this great session guitar player who just passed away not that long ago, JT Cornfloss. He was the best example of that. You could watch him get beat up and forced to replay and tweak and change, and he would get up and look as fresh as when he sat down, because that's the job. It's not, the job is not getting your ideas accepted on the first try. You're just there to help this thing get drug across the goal line. So the more you can allow yourself to just truly accept the idea that you're going to have to reinvent the wheel sometimes, multiple times, right in front of everybody on the floor, and you might get called out, and that's okay. That's what the job is. Nobody sees how many different approaches you did. You know what I mean? And so you really do have to sort of like find a way to put your ego aside and not get attached.
In line with parts, what sort of things do you think about, understanding that it's very subjective, but what sort of things do you think about when you're trying to come up with a standout signature part or a hook line or something in a song?
You want to sound like you're a part of the band. You want to sound like, well, what would a guy do who was in this band, is the way that I look at it. You kind of cast yourself, create some parameters for yourself stylistically. And then for me, it's always about, how does this, relate to the vocal melody? How does this support that? There's not really a shortcut to knowing how to do that.
Right.
But if there was a shortcut, it's combining things that haven't been combined before, So for me, I listen to a lot of music that's not in the genre that I work in. I might, in my head, think, well, this song could almost use a steel part that sounds like it's steel from a Post Malone record. Or this almost sounds like this could be if Mike Campbell from the Heartbreakers played this steel part. Or, I sort of combine these ingredients in my head as a little casting mechanism of like, oh, well, here's how this could work. What would that look like? What would that sound like? Mm-hmm. Again, you want a little bit of familiarity and a little bit of surprise, maybe. So maybe you utilize effects to create something, or the opposite. Maybe it's a very standardized tone, but you're approaching the part in a new way. So you want something to be new and something to be familiar with most of the things that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about ways to be able to take an instrument and make it sound like something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Mm-hmm. Is there any go-to piece of like a multi-effects processor that you really like, that has the ability to, for someone that's kind of wants to just have that first thing in their rig, right, and they got one option? What would you go towards?
Find an overdrive pedal that you really gel with. For me, it's a Distortion. I can use that all the time. I can almost never turn it off. And it can be as subtle as almost no grid at all to, an amp that's about to blow up sounding. Mm-hmm. So I would say seek out an overdrive that does that for you. That is, you're like, I don't have to use it all the time, but I certainly could. And then find something with a lot of firepower in it. So like the Line 6 HX Effects is that for me. I use a lot of expression pedals and expression knobs to change parameters of effects in real time while I'm playing songs, whether it be manipulating reverbs, delays, because you couldn't really have all those pedals in front of you all the time. You couldn't have a a great phaser and an envelope filter and a flanger and it's like and all these different and a plate verb and a particle verb and it's like you wouldn't have all those individual things, but that does a really good job of covering those bases super well, and just learn how to use it. Just find things in it that are new to you, and then find things that replicate things that you're listening. So that can be a part of your transcription process too, is like, why does his slide solo sound like this? And it's like, Google that shit, figure it out. It's like you have that information more now than we ever did. And it's like, embrace the rabbit hole aspect of that kind of stuff and really go down and figure that out.
Yeah. That education is super important for the whole translational thing that you mentioned too. Because if someone is describing a sound and they reference a song and then you go and listen to that song, you have to be able to hear it with your ear and know that there's this, and this on it that created that sound.
Yeah.
And so the only way to do that is just kind of do that research and make sure that you're familiar with the terminology and how to get there.
For sure.
When you're using a unit like the Line 6 effects pedal, how much do you rely on presets versus creating your own presets versus starting with a preset and manipulating it based on
I have a jumping off point that I have dialed up. I almost always change them for the specific song, but I have gone through and dialed up what I think is a good, interesting, usable version of those effects. And then
sometimes they can be overkill.
Oh yeah.
Right. They're designed to just get you excited.
That's right.
But not always fit into a record with a bunch of other instruments.
That's right. Sometimes they can be a little too heavy-handed. And, most of those multi-effects things do have mix knobs, and we're getting really specific about guitar-oriented, steel-oriented effects. But, mess with those mix knobs and figure out how to turn it down to where you can barely tell that it's on, and then do it really heavy-handed and experiment with that in a recording context, because sometimes you want one and sometimes you want another. Sometimes when you're being buried under an avalanche of electric guitars, you need that really heavy-handed approach to the effect. Otherwise, you'll never hear it at all. And other times you might be in a spacious, sparse ballad or something with not a lot of musical or sonic information, that the subtle version of that effect is the move. You got to be willing to constantly assess how you're sitting in the mix.
Absolutely. Is there any piece of maintenance that you found to be really important? That's another thing with equipment. Another thing that I notice with very experienced session players versus people that are just getting into it is not just the equipment itself, but the maintenance of the equipment. What are some things that you do to ensure that your tone is going to be great when you show up for a session?
So making sure that your gear is working good. I'm not like a great, I don't bust out a soldering gun and fix shit. So I usually, if a power supply is going bad, it's out and a new one. And being quick about those kinds of things, because they will pile up on you. But I would say more important than tone from the gear, you have to be able to play in tune, And so making sure that your guitars or your steels or whatever instrument you're playing is set up well in terms of intonation is so important. When I was first learning slide, I would constantly play the notes I was playing on the slide against a low droning note on the guitar. So there was always a reference to know that I was in tune. And then when I started playing steel, I made these loops where it was just an organ pad of just like the root and the fifth of every chord and a simple drum loop in every key. And they would be 10 minutes long. And I would play in every key along with those loops so that there's some accountability there in terms of staying in tune. It's mind-numbing. But at the same time, it allowed me to, because I was sort of thrown into the fire. I got my first road gig on steel with Josh Turner, and I was not the caliber of steel player that should have been on that gig when I first got it. And so it really was a trial by fire. And I was doing that stuff when I was at home, playing along to these little, 7, 8, 10-minute loops in every key and practicing all up and down the neck to try and get my intonation act together.
Remote work has been something that has continued to expand quite a bit. Nearly every first call session player has a setup at home to work. What's your workload like currently with remote recording?
And the pandemic definitely kicked that stuff into high gear. I've always had a home spot. Didn't always sound good in the beginning, but I've always loved having a spot at home. You used to not be able to do that. You know what I mean? Like if you wanted to be a studio player, you had to get your shit together and then just hope it happened right when you went into Ocean Way with a fucking tape machine or whatever. It's like now you have more opportunities than ever to kind of like get your act together and start figuring out mic placement, figuring out how to fit in a track, figuring all that shit out on your own. If you're doing those overdubs for people, you want there to be zero difference in quality between if they had you go to Ocean Way and record and if they sent it to you at home. I want people to not know where it was done.
Right.
So it's
Which
like...
is a challenging thing to get set up in that way. What are some of the elements that helped you get to that point?
Talking to engineers, when you like the way you sound, figure out what they're using on you. Right now, I'm using the Chandler TG2 all the time. I love it so much. But I also have like the Cappy VP28, a 421 on most steel stuff, and a 57 on most electric stuff. It's just what sounds like home to me, and understanding the benefits of a little bit of light compression, how that can frame your track in a way that makes it sound more like a record. I have a distressor that I use that I just touch stuff with. I don't do it so much so that any engineer is going to go, what the hell did you do to this? There's always room for more compression, but if you just touch it with it, it makes it sound more like a record.
And so once you're in a point where you figured out how to get things to sound great, you're able to execute parts, pretty well, and you're starting to get some of those opportunities. What would be your advice for how to begin the process with someone that's sending you something remote? And let's say that this is someone that you haven't necessarily worked with for years.
In that initial communication with somebody, I ask them if they have any ideas, or if they've, a lot of times they will have maybe placeholder parts that they've already been listening to. That's a good place to start. Usually I can figure out what people like within about 2 times of doing stuff for them. You can figure out, they like when I play this kind of register. They like when I include this kind of feeling on chords. You can start to narrow down. But in the beginning, I always give options to people. And it's like, they always give at least 2 different takes that feel like a record to me. And then you just listen to their feedback. Because they'll almost always tell you. They'll be like, dude, this worked out so good. I used almost all of take number 2. And then that tells you. You're like, oh, okay. So they like the higher register, or they like it when I jump on band licks, or they like it when I play off the band licks and let the guitars have their own space. You just have to glean those kind of context clues through your communications with people. You just want them to feel heard, and you want them to trust you.
In that process, sometimes they might respond back and say, hey, this stuff sounds good, but it's not exactly what we're going for.
Yeah.
In the studio, what happens is that we can have that conversation very quickly.
Right.
We can make a change together. You can say, oh, okay, do you like this? They say yes, and then you lay it down. When you're doing stuff remote, it can get a little challenging, and sometimes get a little challenging with not only the communication, but the amount of time that it's taking you versus what you agreed to be paid for it.
Right.
How do you manage that sort of communication?
I err on the side of accommodation. And by and large, the better you get at listening to what they say they want, or the less you have to do that. But I just do it. So if they, I just listen to what they say, and most people will give a specific thing. Like if you get close, but you don't hit it on the head, they will many times say, hey, can we get another option after the first chorus? Can we have you stay out of the way of the vocal more, or, play a little bit more right here? You're gathering information every time you interact with folks like this. I've really only had to be a problem a couple times, and I still err on the side of accommodation. I wouldn't want them to pass my name on in a negative way. Like, this guy wouldn't make it right, or this,
Right. When it does happen, you don't change your approach. You still are accommodating. You still do it that way. because you could argue that, well, hey, this is the fourth time I've had to go back and adjust this and,
Right.
blah, blah, blah. But the amount of time that takes and the impact that would have on their perception of you and what they might say to someone else who doesn't have all of that information that's included in that situation is much more negative than it would be to just finish the job with accommodation and then just maybe be busy next time.
Yeah, that's true. And that happens. Right. There are times when I've had people that are difficult enough to work with that you just sort of don't do it again. And for me, it's not even about having to do it again that would make me not want to work with them. It's more the treatment or the correspondence or,
that's what I mean.
Like if you're not being valued as a creator or a person, but to be honest, like most of these things kind of weed themselves out, because if you can't get it right in two different, times of tweaking and replaying, they're probably going to move on. You know what I mean? Like the chance of it getting to 3 or 4 revisions in my experience is almost never. Because if you're that far off the mark, you're probably not the right guy.
It can also be in the context of where you're a little bit earlier on in your career. And the projects that you're getting are not necessarily from the people that know how to explain what they want, know how to communicate. So for the folks that are listening that may be just getting into it, we want to give them some insight on what questions do you ask? How do you navigate those situations where you're not working with a seasoned, professional that's going to be able to articulate all that stuff.
And that is absolutely true. And I think it's easy for some of us that may be fortunate enough to have already survived that gauntlet, that we're pretty fortunate that most of the people that we're working with pretty well know what they want, and then in the beginning, it's funny. It's like in most creative jobs, it's like the lower paying gigs are the hardest people to please. Again, I would take as many of these scenarios as a learning opportunity as much as you can.
Right.
Every time you get a chance to record is a chance for you to get better at what you're doing. Anytime you maybe are butting up against your ego, not wanting to be wrong, understand that you might need to reorient yourself into a position of gratitude that you have a scenario where you get to learn how to be a little bit better at playing with the record light on again. And the more you can do that, those troublesome scenarios where somebody's asking you to revise it 4 times, they do start to go away. I don't even know how it happens, but it does. Either you get better at pleasing, giving people what they want, or the caliber of collaborators that you have goes up, or both of those things happen.
Yeah, I think both of them happen simultaneously because of that.
Yeah.
Because you're figuring it out, so then you're making it easier, and then because you've proceeded through that whole situation with a positive attitude and an accommodating principle, then they're going to tell their friends, and then eventually you run into the right creative collaborators, and then over time that value rises, and then you're in that sort of position.
And that's one of the kind of like shitty parts of paying your dues in the beginning is there is going to be scenarios where you maybe feel like you're being taken advantage of, and maybe you are, and you just have to understand that this is just a phase. This is a season where you might have to work a little bit harder at pleasing somebody musically than you thought you would. And maybe it doesn't feel so good. You might not even see yourself getting better at it, but the more you do it, you will get better at it.
I love the example of looking at things as a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
I found that value pretty early on when the sessions that I was doing, at first were not that excited. I had one where some lady brought her dogs into a studio and tried to get them to sing with her. And that might have been the moment where I started to have this understanding that every opportunity is one, you should be grateful for it because you have an opportunity to do what you love doing, and someone's paying you something for it.
Yeah.
But secondly, that this is a learning opportunity, and in some way, my future self is becoming more experienced.
Yes.
And I'm going to be better prepared for that situation that I want to be in the future because I made it through this situation.
Yeah. For sure.
being upset about it and frustrated, you're still just going to be in that same situation. So
for sure.
finding that way. And I think I love that you said the learning experience, because that for me was like my way out of those moments.
That's
to be
right.
able to find clarity.
That's right. And it's going to be little for most folks. It's going to be little by little, it's going to be all of a sudden you kind of look around and you're like, hey, all those torturous overdubs or sessions that I had to do suddenly aren't so much a part of my calendar anymore. A session career from what I can gather from me and my peers, it's kind of like steering a barge. You know what I mean? Like, you can't make a lot of quick turns. It's just you get stuff pointed in the right direction, and you just sort of have to keep heading in the right direction without expecting a lot of quick movement to happen. Mm-hmm. It is a game of patience, like you said earlier, and that can be really hard for some of us. But pick a couple goals that are on your horizon and just don't let go. You're going to catch signs from people that are going to reinforce whether or not you should be trying to do this. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's, you just got to trust those. And, people are going to tell you that it's hard, and people are going to tell you, oh, get ready to starve and all that shit. But there's also going to be supportive moments, and let that be the gas in the tank to just keep going. Because the truth be told is, any of these creative careers, you gotta have the risk tolerance to do this and allow yourself to shut out some of the people who want to do more traditional career paths, and because their risk tolerance is going to be very different than yours.